Welcome to Untaught Essentials. I'm Jeremy Hunter. How do you find meaning after midlife? There's got to be more than golfing, right? This is the question today's guest has fascinating answers to. Chip Conley is founder of the Modern Elder Academy, which is the first midlife wisdom school dedicated to helping people renew themselves in a society where youth are increasingly the holders of power. As Western societies age, Chip realized we need new institutions to help people develop a sense of purpose, connection, and meaning in their later years. How do we shift our mindset toward a life of continual growth, learning, and development? Something he calls long life learning. I think you'll find his ideas captivating and profoundly relevant. Welcome, Chip Conley.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So for perhaps the 5 people in the world who don't know who Chip Conley is, could you take a few minutes and introduce us to yourself? You've had quite a fascinating life, I think.
I feel very fortunate. I've had my ups and my downs for sure, but I've learned a lot along the way. I grew up in Southern California and came up to Northern California for college at Stanford and went to Stanford Business School. And about 2 years out of Stanford Business School, I started a boutique hotel company called Joie de Vivre. Sort of a weird name for a company, Joie de Vivre. Like, it's hard to pronounce. Most people in the US don't know what it means or how to spell it. But of course, it means joy of life and joy of living in French. And I really thought that the mission statement could also be the name of the company. Mm-hmm. So I ran that company for 24 years as the CEO. We created 52 boutique hotels around California, mostly Northern California. Became the second largest boutique hotelier in the world or in the US. But the last 2 years of my 24 years of running this company, I hated it. I loved it for 22 years. I hated it for 2 years. There was nothing in between. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe we could unpack it later. It has something to do with going through the midlife, bottom of the U curve of happiness. But I had an NDE. I had a near-death experience that led me to saying that I didn't want to do this anymore. And I sold the company at the bottom of the Great Recession and didn't know what was next. And so there's a great line from the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro when he says, musicians don't retire, they quit when there's no more music left inside of them. Oh, so wow. I was 50 years old and I knew I had music inside of me. I just didn't know who to share it with. And a couple of years later, I was asked by the 3 young founders of Airbnb, this is almost 10 years ago, to help them with their little tech startup that was going global, because nobody in the company had a background in hospitality or travel or entrepreneurship or you name it. And so that was the start of a sojourn, to take my hospitality career and apply it in the tech world. And I learned so much during that time. They ultimately called me the modern elder, which was something I didn't like at first. It's like, what do you mean I'm a modern elder? And they said, well, modern elders are as curious as they are wise. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's about curiosity and wisdom. I was both the mentor and the intern, because at age 52 at that point, I had never worked in a tech company before. So I was the mentor to the founders and to Brian, the CEO. And ultimately, I started to see the value of wisdom. I never really had thought about the difference between wisdom and knowledge. And so 4 years of full-time work there, and then 3.5 years of strategic advisor, significant work. During that time, when I went to strategic advisor role, I wrote my 5th book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. And that's when I had this idea for the world's first midlife wisdom school called the Modern Elder Academy, with the first location opening in southern Baja in Mexico about 4.5 years ago. And now we have locations opening in the Santa Fe, New Mexico area.
Next year, is that right? Or
one of the 2 will open at the end of next year, and the other one will open in 2024.
So that should be very exciting. So there's a lot there.
Well, that's
where to begin.
And I really just gave you more the career side of things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can definitely unpack the personal side as well.
Yeah, and you said you had your ups and downs, which is what I think makes your life so interesting, right? And how the ups go down and then how you come back up from the down is really really, fascinating. And from very early on, you called the hotel chain, joy of life. And it seems to me part of the Chip Conley DNA is something that is interested in meaning and purpose and connectedness. And it almost always has to do with some kind of physical space. Physical space seems to be involved in most of the projects you do.
Which during COVID, when physical space was basically our home and we were not allowed to gather, you can imagine it was a hard period for me. COVID was, not just for business, but just also personally. But yeah, I'm intrigued by anything related to transformation. It's always been fascinating to me. My first hotel in San Francisco was called the Phoenix, the rock and roll hotel. But the Phoenix is also a mythological bird that rises from its own ashes. So it's a form of transformation. And I think that my interest has been, when I had my flatline experience, I was giving a speech in St. Louis, Missouri. And after the speech, I was signing books, and I had and this flatline experience 9 times in 90 minutes, probably due to an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. I had a broken ankle and a septic leg, which was, why was I going and giving a speech in St. Louis when I had that? Good question. So
your heart stopped 9 times, is that right? Or
yeah, my heart stopped 9 times in 90 minutes, usually for about 10 to 12 seconds. Sometimes I had to have the electric paddles, out. So I had Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's seminal book on, meaning based upon his experience in a concentration camp in World War II. I had that in my backpack. And so, I'd always found the book interesting, but to read that book in the ICU or in my hospital room, I was there for 2 or 3 days, really gave it a whole new twist. And I created this equation: despair equals suffering minus meaning. And despair equals suffering minus meaning. And there was an element for me like, oh, wow. If you have a little bit of Buddhist tendencies, suffering is the first noble truth. So the suffering is ever present. So the first noble truth of Buddhism. So what that means is despair and meaning are inversely proportional. The more you have meaning, the less despair you have, and vice versa. So that experience, which I had when I was, just on the verge of 48 years old, woke me up to the idea of, like, on a daily basis, how can I metabolize the meaning of my life? And I've been doing it ever since. And I got to say that there's making meaning is something that I think is maybe a human quality or trait that may not be true. It's hard to know with other animals. But I think it's an essential one, especially when we're going through really difficult times.
That's really interesting. So understanding you have the capacity to make meaning, right? And that it's not foisted upon you.
Correct.
I think is, in a way, that's, to me, it's like the hallmark of, it's one kind of maturity, right? Like you get to decide your own story at some level, even in the moment.
Right? Exactly. It's how are you writing your narrative? How are you adapting it? For me, now the way I look at it is, how are you cultivating and harvesting wisdom in the process of experience? I believe that wisdom is the metabolizing experience to create distilled compassion. And to me, that's my definition of wisdom. And I do believe that when you're going through difficult times, if you can metabolize the experience, so there's a lesson in it, so there's some learning in it, it's to your advantage. And then the idea that it actually creates either empathy or compassion, which are 2 different words, 2 different meanings, but there are some similarities, is ultimately what, as humans, helps define what real wisdom is. Because wisdom, if it's purely metabolized experience, it could be quite selfish. It could be just self-serving. And I don't know a lot of people who are wise and selfish. They may be smart and selfish, but they aren't necessarily wise and selfish. So yeah, so I would just say for me, my life has been an exercise in trying to find the meaning through some of the most bizarre and difficult circumstances.
So, okay, we could just talk for an hour just on what you just laid down, right? There's so let's look at that. Why is it that so often human beings need some kind of intense crisis to jolt them into a transformative process, or at least out of their kind of day-to-day sleepwalking, right, through their life? Why do you think that is?
I mean, we're habitual creatures, so our natural tendency is to fall into the pattern and pace of what we're used to. I mean, this is actually part of the reason why creating our first MEA campus in Mexico, in a rural part of Mexico that's sort of foreign, was really helpful, because it meant people, it's not like, oh, let's do this in Ojai or in Napa Valley where people can drive from LA or San Francisco, or Hudson Valley drive from New York. No, actually, you're having to jump on a plane. In fact, you're actually having to have a passport. You're going to be in a place that is not familiar. And familiarity doesn't just breed contempt, it breeds apathy. And the apathy does not necessarily give you the motivation to be liminal. And so liminal is a word I didn't know 5 years ago. So in my process, I've been liminal in my life, but I never really knew the word. And then I learned the word, and I was like, oh, what a precious word. What a spectacular word. What a word that, describes life. Life is liminal. And yet when we're as adults and we're going through a liminal period, a period of transition, a period that feels like you're in limbo, you're in between two things, we often feel like we're getting something wrong. Instead of thinking this is a natural state, being in liminality, and liminality can actually be a beautiful state in which great things come out of a liminal period. Instead, we sort of feel like, shoot, I'm playing the game of life wrong. And, I'm not doing well on this board game. And I just think it doesn't serve people at all to think that that's how they're living their life. And that is, in some ways, I lost 5 friends to suicide during 2008 to 2010, all men, all in midlife. And I just know that if I were to sort of go back and look at what's the common thread, that none of them knew each other either. So this is not like some contagion. This is like 5 separate people over the course of about 30 months. But I think the commonality was they felt like they were getting their life wrong. And in fact, what they were doing was just living a natural life and hitting some of the speed bumps that we all hit. But women talk about their speed bumps. Men just drive faster. So.
Yeah. Again, like every sentence you say, we could just take a deep dive in every one of them. We both have this interest in transition and how do you navigate transition. And I think an element of that is we live in a society that sees time in a straight line and you're always going forward. And if you ever feel like you're going backward, that feels like failing, right? But if you see time in a circle or in a cycle, then you know there are going to be times of expansion and growth, and then times of contraction and recollection.
Yeah.
And we don't prepare people for the contraction, right? We're only about the expansion. And so when you're in that middle period of I'm not here and I'm not there, you feel like, you failed.
What we do as a society is we encourage the distraction from the contraction. So it's the distraction, and the distraction is alcohol, it's sex, it's whatever it is. I mean, I don't want to just outline 20 distractions, but often the distraction is the thing that actually is taking us away from the opportunity to actually metabolize the experience, and learn the wisdom from it. And yeah, so it's, distraction to the toward the contraction. That's, I think, a really interesting way to look at it. And when it's sort of like having a wound. So I went to the Dead Sea. I've gone to the Dead Sea a few times. And my partner's Israeli, so I've been to Israel a few times. So what's fascinating is if you go to the Dead Sea, it's very salty, it's the kind of place where by the time you walk into the Dead Sea and you've gone up to about your thighs, your legs have gone in the air because it's that buoyant. So you can just float without doing anything. But the other thing about the Dead Sea is that with the minerals and the salt, if you have a cut on your hand or anywhere on your body, it hurts, because what's happening is all of those minerals are going in there. But then you look at this, this cut on your hand, you literally see yourself heal, at the Dead Sea. It's more like the live sea, because it's what you're seeing is life in its metabolizing condition. And when it comes to our emotional state or the things we go through, we need more Dead Sea conditions in our emotional lives. That sounds so strange, but it means, how do we metabolize the experience so we heal from it faster? And because otherwise, the distractions and all the other things we do to it just mean that the wound doesn't heal, or it just actually festers, or etc. And then that's there's sort of a lot of metaphor there, but I really do believe that learning how to metabolize experience efficiently and effectively is one of the signs of adulthood. It's also one of the signs of childhood. When you're a child, like, children don't have mixed emotions. This is like, children's emotions are pure. I'm angry. I'm happy. Like I hate you. I love you. There's no distortion. It's just sort of like, and then we become adults and we have mixed emotions. And then often we don't even understand our emotions. I just started reading Brene Brown's At the Atlas of the Heart, which is funny because I wrote a book called Emotional Equations a few years ago. And I was like reading her book and I'm like, she did it. I wrote a book, and my book did really well. It was a New York Times bestseller, but I'm reading her book and I'm like, oh, this is such a better book than my book. Same subject. It's the same subject. It's really helping people to have a primer on their emotions. But we don't do that. We really, as we get to be adults, we try to outrun our emotions. We have mixed emotions and we act out in just the strangest of ways. So, being able to understand your emotions, to articulate them in such a way that you have emotional fluency, and then to actually know how to take the action to, if it's a healing that's needed, heal the emotion, or if it's an elation or some kind of thing that you can't bottle an emotion, just like you can't bottle the weather. The weather's going to do what it's going to do, and so are your emotions. The question is, how do you influence, the emotion, your weather, your internal weather, in such a way that it, allows you to get through the storms faster and to linger and have gratitude around the sunny days.
Yeah, it's interesting because what passes for education in this culture is all about we're going to teach you abstraction, right? Like abstract thinking, but we don't teach you anything about seeing, like how do you see what's happening more clearly, and we certainly don't teach you anything about feeling, as you've been saying, right? And
I think there's a Drucker quote on that one about like you probably can tell it to me.
Yes, we've overtrained in analysis and undertrained in perception.
Exactly.
Teach people to think, but we don't teach them to see. And so if the world changes and you don't perceive the change, how do you adapt to it? And so this idea of a metabolizing emotion is really interesting to me on any number of reasons, right? So it's, what do we do with emotion, right? We push it away. Like I pretend it's not there. I call that the Japanese national emotional strategy. Pretend it's not there. I'm going to put it under the closet and pretend everything's fine. Or I'm going to give it to you, right? I'm going to yell at the team or kick the dog or drink it or whatever. But then there's this middle way of why not just feel it? You know, like one of my rules is feelings are meant to be felt, which is how I understand what metabolizing the emotion is, like just experiencing that energy.
Well, there's a beautiful Rumi poem called The Guest House. I won't read it right here. Maybe if you have show notes, you can put it in the show notes. It's a spectacular poem. And I love it partly because I'm a hospitality person. And it basically says, you know, you're like the innkeeper, and the innkeeper welcomes all of the emotions to come into the home, but no one is meant to be a squatter. He doesn't use that word, but no one's meant to sort of like stay. They're all meant to be here for a period of time, and you're meant to welcome them with graciousness and then allow them to move on their way. And it's a much better poem than I just tried to paraphrase, but it's really accurate. It's really accurate because when you allow it to come through you, it doesn't have as much power over you.
So, like taking that back to the topic of transition, when somebody is kind of in that middle period where, you know, something in their life has ended, they're not yet in their new thing, that middle period surfaces all of the stuff that they haven't dealt with oftentimes, right? And
there's that, and there's just also the, you know, we have a lot of education when we're younger, and we have guidance counselors. We have all of this support, and you know, let's take just a smidgen of childhood. Let's take just adolescence. So adolescence, which is perceived to happen approximately when you hit puberty and go till about age 18. That word adolescence did not exist in 1903. It was a 1904 creation by G. Stanley Hall, president of the American Psychological Association, who basically said adolescence is a life stage. It's when people are going through, or kids are going through, emotional, hormonal, and identity transitions in preparation for adulthood. And so we sort of gave kids a lot of additional support. We just said, okay, well, you don't get married at age 14, and you don't have to work in the mines at age 15. There's child labor laws now. And we're going to have public junior high schools and high schools that are available to almost everybody. And so there was this reckoning, a societal reckoning. We need the same societal reckoning when it comes to midlife. And there's a word that is, you know, sort of well known amongst sociologists and gerontologists now, but not well known in the public, which is midolescence. It's a creation of the last 20 or 25 years, the word. Midolescence is the adult corollary to adolescence. You're going through hormonal and emotional and identity transitions. And yet, knowing that this is true, and knowing that since 1965, we've had the term midlife crisis, we have done very little. And also knowing the most recent social science around this, which is fascinating, which is called the U-curve of happiness research, and basically shows that from about age 22 till about age 47.2, your mileage may vary, that's the average, you have a long, slow decline in life satisfaction. You hit a bottom between 45 and 50. And then with each passing decade after that, up until the last 3 or 4 years of your life, you are happier in each decade. You're happier. So happier in 50s than 40s, 60s than 50s, 70s and 60s. And so there's an element of like, wow, why don't we give more attention and public health support to people in this period of life that we know is challenging, and where they're going through midolescence, a lot of transitions. So that is really, you know, from a sort of academic perspective, why I wanted to create the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school, a place where people could come and navigate their midlife transitions, not alone, but with tools and resources and social support. The social wellness of a community in a cohort of 20 people where they're all going through their forms too, but it's not just CEOs leaving their jobs. It's like, empty nesters getting divorced. It's someone being a sandwich generation, taking care of both their ailing parents who are about to die, as well as their teenage kids as a single mother. And so wisdom is not taught, it's shared. And creating the crucible for a shared experience where you realize you're not alone, and there's a lot of best practices to learn from others in the group. And yes, we do provide a curriculum and faculty and a framework that helps to give people, well, we've got over 2,000 alumni now from 33 countries, helps them to have some level of common experience. Yes, we're not just a sort of a retreat center where people say, oh, I'm going to go to the retreat center and go to so-and-so's workshop. That's fine. I mean, I was on the board of the Esalen Institute in Big Sur for 10 years, and I taught there for 15 years. It's a great place, but your experience there will be wildly different depending upon what workshop you have. Because we have a curriculum, 150-page workbook, and a lot of commonality in terms of our internal faculty. It's a different experience. It's a little bit more like going to an academy or a school than it is going to a traditional retreat center.
There's something that's shared as you're going through.
Correct.
What are some of the questions you would get asked if you were participating there?
Here's a question. I mean, there's all kinds of questions, but because actually it is really a very much a place from catalytic curiosity is a lot of the overall gestalt there, the ethos. So one would be, what is it that you know or have done today or now that you wish you'd known or done 10 years ago? Think about that for a moment. And then now ask yourself the question, what is it 10 years from now you will regret if you don't know it, learn it, or do it now? And so, it's a question that I asked myself at age 57. I'm 61 now, which led me to learning Spanish. I was living in Mexico. I learned French, which led to Joie de Vivre as my hotel company name. But it'll be not easier. It'll be harder at 67 than 57. I should start learning Spanish, or I should start learning how to surf because I live near a surf break. Harder to do at 67. So so anticipated regret is a form of wisdom. Wisdom, can be, one of the ways to find your wisdom can be to anticipate the regret you might have. What's another question? The average age of the people who come to MEA is 54. Well, guess what? The average age of our alums in terms of how long they think they're going to live is 90. So they think on average they're going to live till 90, and the average age of them when they come to MEA is 54. Do the math. You are halfway through your adult life at 54. If you think of adult life starting at age 18. 18 to 54 is 36 years. 54 to 90 is 36 years. So that's a question like, oh my gosh, if at age 54, I'm only halfway through my adult life, how would I curate my life differently? Knowing that I have a lot more adulthood ahead of me than I thought I did. So that's another kind of question we would ask. Another kind of question we would ask is, wisdom is very personal. Wisdom is something that it's not knowledge. Knowledge is something you accumulate, and you can find it in an encyclopedia or on Google. Wisdom, on the other hand, is often that metabolized experience. And it's something that's sort of like your fingerprints. So if knowing that wisdom is not knowledge, and knowing that your wisdom is quite personal to who you are and what you might offer, what are 5 pieces of wisdom you might offer someone a generation or 2 younger than you? And what that question gets to is, you have developed some wisdom over time. You don't even know it, because generally speaking, our wisdom is the thing we hold closest to us. It's how we operate our lives. But it's like, the water is to a fish. It doesn't even realize it's there. I think my experience at Airbnb was fascinating in that regard, because they hired me for my knowledge. What they got was my wisdom. What I didn't realize is my wisdom was as valuable as it was because I was so familiar with it. But so much of the wisdom was emotional intelligence and understanding humans, um, and again, that pattern recognition, which is what wisdom often is something you can get better at with age because you've seen more patterns. That doesn't mean that necessarily wisdom is correlated with age. There's a lot of evidence that it's not. And that's partly because there's a lot of people who, as they get older, get crankier and get in a fixed mindset. And they're not cultivating wisdom at all. They are not cultivating wisdom. They're curating their war stories. And their war stories they define as wisdom, when in fact it is just their lived experience, not in any way adapted for the listener. It's like, this is the way the world works. And that's when you have, okay, boomer. Okay, boomer. Okay, boomer, I don't need to hear your war stories. Okay, boomer, I don't know, have to hear from you how the world works. And of course, I could have had an okay boomer experience. I'm a boomer. When I joined Airbnb, where the vast majority of people there were millennials. But instead of going and saying here, here's how the world works, or here's how the hotel industry works, because I mean, that's another form of it. It's like, okay, you've hired me to come in and tell you how the hotel industry works, as well as a bunch of other things. I can tell you how it works, but actually, better yet, I'll ask you some questions about how you want your company to be and how you want an Airbnb experience to be with the host. I was in charge of all the hosts globally. And I was in charge of strategy for the company. I was in charge of a bunch of stuff. And so instead of sort of saying, here's how it works, I started with, well, tell me how you'd like to see it work for you. And then let's create a bridge to how it works in the hotel industry, because how it will work for Airbnb is somewhere in between. We are not a hotelier. And so I mean, it's just asking good questions. I'm a big believer in appreciative inquiry, which is a method of asking questions. It's one of the techniques and tools we teach at MEA. And it also helps foster curiosity. And I do think, as we get older, curiosity is such an important ingredient. It's a bit of an elixir of life, a fountain of youth. It's something that it brings us back to a place in our life where we're open to learning and having a beginner's mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's just so much there. David Cooperrider was on last fall, actually.
Oh,
and
yeah.
He's such an amazing human being. We've talked about curiosity a lot. And again, like one of the strange things we have in common, my doctoral dissertation was on interest. And it came out of this realization that when I was a teenager, that every human being, probably every mammal, I would guess, is born interested and curious about the world. Mm. It's just a basic function, but not every human being dies with curiosity about the world. Mm. And I wanted to know why. Because it just seemed so obvious, right? And that there wasn't actually much of a literature on curiosity. It was so, as you say, so in the water, no one had really researched it so much. Mm-hmm. And they didn't even consider it an emotion for, at least at that time. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me, I think there are a couple of things that are germane to this conversation. Like what I did was study teenagers, like who was more curious and who wasn't, like who was engaged in their world and who wasn't. And the startling, interesting finding was that upper middle class kids were the least curious.
Interesting.
Without fail. Hmm. And they were, and that, say, blue collar kids who were either African American or Latinx were the most curious. Hmm. And that even upper middle class kids or upper class kids were more curious than upper middle class kids.
Hmm. And why do you think that is?
Here's my theory. Upper class kids have intergenerational wealth. Hmm. So they are at some level freer to choose what they want. Mm-hmm. Upper middle class kids need a salary. Mm-hmm. And there was another bit of data that I think corroborates this, that kids who were more engaged and curious about the world came from families that supported them, said, I love you unconditionally, and they challenged them. I expect you to do your best. Mm. Kids who did not have that, kids who came from families that challenged them but didn't support them, I expect you to do your best, and love is a conditional thing, right? We're the most disengaged. And so I think for upper middle class families, it meant, look, if you want to maintain this level of life, material life, you got to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, even though you might want to be poet, kindergarten teacher, something that speaks to who they are, right? And I think that in a way denied them their own natural curiosity. I think they check out. Yeah. They weren't the bad kid. They were the kid you never heard from in the classroom.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to know what you think about that, given your own experience.
Well, I mean, my sense is there's something about being able to draw outside the lines. And there's an entitlement for the rich kids, and they can draw outside the lines. There's for a middle class or a poorer kid, especially if they're a kid who's from a BIPOC background, racial or ethnic minority, maybe they can draw outside the lines or not. I mean, quite sometimes it'll be the opposite.
Yeah,
there's a regimentation, like I have to live within that. Having grown up in a middle class to like maybe upper middle class family, but I went to high school in the inner city, Snoop Dogg's high school. So I was the curious white boy because I was a minority as a white guy. I saw it. I was very curious. I was culturally curious. I mean, they called me the curious white boy. Truly, that was my nickname. But my friends that grew up in my neighborhood who were 80% white, but we're now going to a school that was 70% non-white. They had a hard time. They had a lot of judgment. They had a lot of they didn't know how to fit in. And they were from families where drawing outside the lines was not acceptable because there was a keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's, sometimes that's what you see in middle to upper middle class families, is this sense of keeping up with. There's the comparison, comparison is the recipe for suffering. And so I think that the idea of the comparison for kids in that environment might lead them to being robots. Because curiosity is not an efficient emotion. It's not. And this is why it's actually not popular in companies. Someone asked, I was the most curious person, Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, who I was mentoring, but who was my boss as well. And he was 21 years younger than me. He said, Chip, you're the most curious person in this company. And I remember when he said that to me, I was 52 years old. And I'm like, yes, I love that. I want to be the most curious person in the company. But he said, and then he finished his sentence. He said, and sometimes your curiosity slows down the meetings a little bit. And I know what he meant, because I used to run meetings as CEO of my own company for 24 years. And there's the guy who asked these curious questions, and where's this coming from, Chip? And there was, so it was more like he was sort of saying to me, there's a time and a place for your curiosity. And it was so interesting to hear this 31-year-old saying to me, the 52-year-old, that, but I got it. I got where it was coming from. And I said, we went into sports analogy, and he said, it's like, if you were a basketball player and your curiosity was throwing hoops, and only a third of your hoops, actually your shots made in the hoop, that's not a very good percentage for basketball. And I said, well, I'm a baseball player, and getting on base or having a hit 333, having a batting average of 333 is really good. And I said, it's partly because some of those times I get on base, it's a home run. So you may have a strikeout from me, but Babe Ruth was the strikeout king as well as the home run king. And so curiosity leads to both strikeouts and home runs. And if a company doesn't want that, then that's fine. And when I actually articulated it that way to Brian was able to say, yes, we want that. We want home runs. So keep it going. But I had to really sort of do my own mental gymnastics to sort of help him to see this is not, basketball, it's baseball. And, in baseball, you have the home runs. And the home runs are when we come up with a new idea that would not have happened without curiosity. Because curiosity is the elixir. It's truly the taproot for creativity and innovation. I mean, all companies want to be creative and innovative, but they don't even realize that curiosity is sort of like the raw material that leads to that. Not the only raw material, but it's certainly an important one.
I mean, I just love it. That's so it. That's because this
speechless. Jeremy is speechless.
Well, it's like, how do I articulate this thought? Because it's like, what is life, right? Like, what is life? And so this relationship between exploration and curiosity, like exploration isn't efficient either, because sometimes you get lost, right?
Yeah.
And yet sometimes you find the lost city of gold. And I mean, yeah, okay, there's like 15 things I want to say right now. As you say, in a company, if the company is all about performance and execution, then going back to Drucker, what happens when what it's performing on and executing on no longer becomes relevant? And then where does it go? So how do you build in curiosity and exploration into a firm so that it is constantly, or that it has a regular interaction with its environment to say, okay, is what we're doing still relevant? Because I think you can get into execution mode and then not even see that, oh, wait a minute, the market's moved on. But I think there's something more fundamental and more interesting, which is I think living systems want to learn, right? And that's how they keep living, right? That's how they adapt. Right?
Learning leads to evolution. Learning leads to evolving.
Exactly, which is one of my questions for you. Is like, what is learning for you? We think of learning as, oh, I've memorized some trivia from the Sunday paper, but I think learning is more than that. And I'm kind of curious to hear what your perspective is.
My perspective on this, and as you can tell, I have lots of perspectives. Some of them may be so stupid, but I have a perspective. I think that's not a bad thing, as long as they're strongly believed but not tightly held. I mean, you're open to having them adapt. So I believe that we talk a lot about lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is, I mean, no one I know sort of quarrels with the idea of lifelong learning. It's sort of like as valuable as apple pie in an American kind of way, but it's not just an American thing. But lifelong learning speaks to the idea almost generically that how you learn and what you want to learn at age 30 is the same as at age 60. And I fundamentally don't agree with that. I think lifelong learning has a subset, and it's called long life learning. So long life learning is the premise that you want to live a life that's as deep and meaningful as it is long. And what you want to learn at age 60 or 65 or 45 or 50 may be different, and how you learn it may be different than it is when you learned it at 25 or at 30. And so I wrote a white paper with a PhD named Ingo Roth called The Emergence of Long Life Learning, because I really wanted to study how do people learn in midlife and beyond, and what are the opportunities to start investing. I mean, higher education as an industry, we know has some risks. Clay Christensen, the guy who created the term disruptive innovation, said before he passed away and before COVID that 50% of the colleges and universities in the United States will be out of business in 10 to 15 years. So how does higher education adapt in an environment where there's a shrinking number of people at their age cohort, and there's a less respect for the idea of higher education in that age cohort than there used to be? And while there's this growing, pig in the python of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s who desperately want to not just tap into knowledge, that's part of it, but actually then see how it's relevant to them and also sort of adapt it. I mean, to learn philosophy or psychology in your 50s is very different than learning it at age 19.
Yeah.
In terms of how you can sort of understand it. So I do think that what we're going to see from a learning perspective societally is a growing number of midlife wisdom schools like MEA, a growing number of programs like Stanford's DCI program, Distinguished Careers Institute, or Harvard's ALI, Advanced Leadership Institute, programs that are really oriented toward giving people the ability to maybe take a gap year and supplement their life with a new curiosity and a new learning. I do think that if it's just like, sometimes these programs, there's a lot of them now at universities, they're pretty much just saying, come back to college and learn like you were when you were 18 or 20. And I think that's just a mistake. I think, yes, sit in classrooms with 20-year-olds, great. But then actually have some additional learning that speaks to what it means to be 55 years old. Because long life learning is about how to curate a life that's as deep and meaningful as it is long. So therefore, some of what you want to learn, I mean, some of it's as simple as brain health as we age, or physical health as we age. I mean, that's pretty functional and that's knowledge-based. But some of it, could be the philosophical or the psychological or the spiritual kinds of sustenance that actually is more resonant for someone, when they're at 55 than
when they're closer to death than they are their birth.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I just so I think learning, I think if we can look and see that there's a new niche in the lifelong learning world, which is called long life learning, and we respect that this niche has a huge opportunity for society in helping people feel relevant still, but also in for universities as a revenue producer.
Well, we are starting one at the Drucker School as well. And so what is learning, do you think, though? Like, what is that? Because it's more than just getting good at Trivial Pursuit.
Yeah. I mean, learning to my mind, learning is the combination of how do you take knowledge and life experience and make it relevant to your own life. That's what true learning is. Because if you actually just memorizing things and not really metabolizing it, not making it relevant, then it's not learning, it's memorizing. And that's a different thing. To memorize something, which is sort of how we've trained our kids, with SATs and all, memorizing is, and the brain is much better at memorizing when we're younger, for sure. The brain, the nature of the brain is, we're very focused, as the brain is very focused when we're young. As we get older, we get to this more holistic thinking, difference between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And the crystallized intelligence allows you to think systemically a little bit more and connect the dots. So yeah, as a 61-year-old, I would hate, I hate memorizing speeches. When I've been lucky enough to give a couple TED speeches, and I feel like I have to memorize the speech, which is not my natural extemporaneous way of giving a talk. Right. And I hate it because memorizing at 61 is not nearly as easy as it is at 21. But learning is not that. That is memorizing. Learning is really understanding how do you take knowledge look at the lived experience piece of it, and then saying, how is this relevant, not just to my life, but to the way the world works, in a way that it creates a sort of a point of view and a perspective.
Which makes it useful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. In the closing bits of this conversation, you talk about regenerative communities.
Yeah.
And so we've talked about how do you regenerate a life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can you say what a regenerative community is?
Well, just like I want to disrupt higher education, I'd like to disrupt retirement communities. And I think they're ready to be disrupted, partly because, if you talk to people my age or, in the MEA 2000 alums, I mean, there's a tiny fraction of them that want to go move in a retirement community someday.
It's just like a warehouse, basically.
It's
right?
Age apartheid warehouse where people are there to, in many ways, live with people who I don't know. I mean, I get why retirement communities came about. There was sort of this idea of the leisure world, this idea of, you've worked your 40 years on the factory floor, or 30 years, or however long. You've been a secretary your whole life. You're so over that, and you now want to live the leisure life. But what we've come to realize in the last 60 years, since retirement communities became prevalent in the United States, is that retirement accelerates your mortality. It does. It's like there's no way around it. It just does, and it does for a lot of reasons I won't go into. And therefore, retirement communities could accelerate your mortality. Not so good. Retirement communities don't give you any intergenerational connection, except for when your family comes to visit you. I mean, retirement communities are 55 plus, but let's be honest, they're 82 plus. That's generally who's living in a retirement community. So a regenerative community is the opposite of that. It's intergenerational. It's, instead of built on a fairway, it's built on a farm. The farm is a regenerative farm using regenerative agricultural principles. And the idea is regenerating people's souls and their sense of purpose and their connection to community. Why not have a co-working space in a regenerative community that's free, where younger people can come in and get mentored by someone who's older, or vice versa? The older people can be mentored by the younger people when it comes to technology. So the idea of a regenerative community where people are living in community around a farm or a regenerative ranch, and they're creating their own regenerative principles. They're having meditation classes in the morning and yoga classes in the afternoon. And there's a potluck every Saturday night. Anybody who wants to come to the potluck. Because, one last thought is, caregiving in the US is just on the verge of being an epidemic challenge. It's already a challenge for sure, but it's even going to get worse. And it's partly because of a lack of immigration into the United States and a growing aging population. Caregiving doesn't have to be acute caregiving. It can be the person who lives next door to you and knows that you're not feeling well and is going to go to the store for you, or the pharmacy. It could be, the person living next to you who helps to see that you're not lonely. I mean, caregiving can be something that, like it used to be, which is your family provided you because they were intergenerational. Everybody was living together. There was care there. You didn't need to have services provided by someone else. So I think that's part of this as well, is how do we help create a place where people go all together? There's something called the Villages, not the place in Florida, which is like famous and 110,000 people live in it. But the Villages is a concept where people live in their homes as if they're in a village and they get services from each other. And that's, all we're doing is taking that idea and saying, you build the homes around a farm and you're all living together in a community, as opposed to in disparate homes around a city.
And having a very direct relationship with life, I think
Correct.
Watching the process of life growing vegetables.
So we have a regenerative community in Baja called Baja Sage, and we have two that we're going to be opening in Santa Fe, New Mexico as well. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, so far so good.
Well, it's an exciting vision. Thank you so much. We'll put all the links to your books, TED Talks, the MEA in the show notes so people can learn more if they want to, which I'm sure they will. So
Thank you, Jeremy.
thank you, Chip. It was
I'm looking forward to more time together.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.